Balance. Balance is a harness. My entire career has been devoted to this idea, to this moment. Decades. If the unifying theories are correct, we will soon be able to harness the power of a black hole. Nothing will ever be the same. Why? This is wrong. The field is failing. What happened? Where am I? Why am I being imprisoned? Release me!
Sigma, the perfect super tank before super tanks were a thing. Since he released in August of 2019, Sigma hasn't known such a thing as irrelevancy, remaining at the top of the game no matter how much the meta shifts. Sometimes a little too much even, but let's not dwell on that just yet. Despite his capability to remain present in the game, even at his lowest, you'd have a hard time finding somebody that actively complains when they see him, which is shocking to say the least. This is all thanks to his design philosophy, where instead of having great strengths that come with equally great flaws as most other tanks do, Sigma forsakes streams in favor of stability, and this puts him in an interesting position as an Overwatch 2 tank, because no matter how much the meta shifts, it can't shift in a way that forces him out of it, because even when you target his weaknesses directly, he has enough tools to hold his ground. But unlike Orisa, he does so in ways that are far less frustrating for the enemy player, which makes him far more enjoyable to play as and against. Sigma is what I believe peak Overwatch 2 tanking looks like, which is a crazy statement to make when you remember he's been this way since Overwatch 1. See, Sigma fits right in now that all of his peers have been buffed to his level, but to the unaware, or to those who have repressed the memory, he was actually stronger in Overwatch 1 than in Overwatch 2. And it wasn't because his Skit was inherently unhealthy or anti-fun, it's because, well, he simply had too much Kit as is. And thanks to him having ever so slightly too much going for him, he became the final nail in Overwatch 1's coffin, creating double shield. So even though Sigma is not a problem in the game currently, and Overwatch 1 is long dead and buried, I still think there's valuable lessons to be learned from looking at Sigma's design, both in his Overwatch 2 perfection and his Overwatch 1 atrocities. Especially the latter, since those that don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. Sigma in Overwatch 2 found himself in an interesting spot, because while all of his peers had to be powered up to become part of the newly found super tank role, he himself was basically the same, if not even a little weaker. Every other tank in Overwatch 2 had to become a super tank to compensate for the loss of their tank partner. Sigma, on the other hand, had always been designed to be independent of his fellow tank. He could benefit from them still, but he didn't need to, at least not in the same way. His primary fire is middle range, which forces him to get awfully close to the enemy, but he has his shield to help him close that gap and maintain frontline presence without needing help. His barrier can be walked or died past, but he has grass to protect him even if you do, as well as being able to just redeploy his barrier almost instantly. And if that fails, he still has accretion as another way of handling a situation where he'd otherwise be at an awful disadvantage. Sigma has all the tools he needs to defend himself without any help. However, and like other super tanks, each of these tools are fair. His shield can be walked past or pierced, grasp only works in one direction, and accretion is heavily telegraphed. This all means that even though Sigma has tools to deal with a bad situation, all of those tools have weak points themselves that the enemy player can use to their advantage to still come out ahead. I like to call this design philosophy autonomous mutual counterplay, where a character has the built-in means to outplay his counters, but these means can be outplayed in return through commonly available things such as moving or good positioning. You pair this with the fact that Sigma has no overwhelming strength to speak of, prior to the last patch anyways, and you end up with a hero that is really hard to force out, not saying that it's impossible, but at the same time they don't have the means to force anybody else out. He has high resistance to one of the tank role's biggest pain points, being counter swapping, while also not making the problem worse himself in any substantial way. While you can make the argument that this is dull and not as interesting as a riskier design, ultimately it's kind of healthier for the game for it to be this way. And besides, in actual execution, Sigma is still a fun tank to play, without being as frustrating to fight as other tanks. So I think calling him the best is far from outrageous. Unless your pick is Ramatra, I think that's fair too. But if Sigma's design is so good in Overwatch 2, then how come he was such a big issue in Overwatch 1? I did say a format didn't change design quality, so what exactly went wrong? In Overwatch 1, Sigma instantly dominated his competition, quickly rising to be the best tank not just at the time, but in the game's history. It wasn't even close either. Right off the bat, he was just overtuned. As I stated before, Overwatch 2 Sigma is actually weaker than his release version in everything other than health. Moreover, think about what I said Sigma's design philosophy is, that of an independent tank that can handle things by himself just fine. That design works great in 5v5 because the tank is under a great amount of pressure at all times and counter-swapping holds much more power. So being harder to pressure into swapping is fantastic. In 6v6 though, it's a bit of a problem. Because in Overwatch 1, tanks were made to have strengths and weaknesses, and tank synergies will use each other's strengths to cover their weaknesses and amplify those strengths. However, when you throw a tank with no real weaknesses into the midst, well, they don't need to cover anything, so they can just amplify their strengths to the moon. And that led us straight into Double Shield, a comp with no weaknesses, because every member of it had few to none, and they could cover each other's just fine. Double Shield is a lot more complicated than just Sigma and Orisa being strong. I mentioned in the last video that 2 shields aren't enough for the comp to work, and I think calling it Double Shield has created this misconception that it is. Double Shield was not a problem because there were 2 shields, it was a problem because you couldn't get past the shields due to immense firepower. And you couldn't do anything even if you did get in because they still had many options after that. It should more accurately be called a hyper-sustain comp, since the problem at its core is the sustain, which is primarily provided by the supports, but all of that is a can of worms for another day. Nonetheless, it was still Sigma that finally put it all together, because he was without flaw and was horrendously overkitted, with all of his kills individually doing more than they should have. His shield was as easy to deploy as Reinhardt's, but it wasn't attached to him, nor did it stop him from using his other abilities. Grasp is not just a defense matrix, but it also gave him overhealth after it's finished. Accretion cannot be absorbed or deflected for some reason, and his ultimate is a massive AoE that movement locks you and deals 50% of your maximum health as true damage to you. So you have a tank that was released overtuned, has no real weaknesses by design, but is meant to have no real strengths either, and then you pair him with heroes that grant him those very strengths he should not have, and suddenly it makes a lot more sense how things went so horribly wrong so fast after he came out. However, while it is true that Sigma ended up breaking the game, I don't actually think that was because of his design philosophy, that of a more balanced tank with less strengths and weaknesses. Instead, I think it was because of the execution of it, specifically the fact that Sigma had too many ways of mitigating his weaknesses, having not one but 2 different ways of dealing with being dope. So if we were to take some of his power away in favor of him being more affected by his weaknesses, he should fall closer in line with the rest of the Overwatch 1 tanks. But how exactly do you do that, without breaking the character in the opposite direction? Unlike Orisa, who I believe would have required a whole rework in order to be unproblematic, Sigma is actually not that bad at his core. He doesn't have any inherently unhealthy parts to him, he just has too many parts. So in order to make him fall in line, we have to take a couple of them away. There's 2 ways of approaching this. 1, take away an entire ability, or 2, nerf every ability. Starting with option 1, taking away an entire ability would put his ability total in line with Overwatch 1 Winston, meaning his strength as a character could still be felt through good use of his set abilities, while also opening up more weaknesses for him, which in turn would make him rely more on his team, which is good. Overwatch 1 was a lot more team-oriented, and making Sigma follow that idea is a good thing. But which one should he lose? Well, it can be his primary fire, obviously. His accretion is his only offensive ability and has both proactive and reactive uses, which make it quite a dynamic skill. And even though it's a stun, it's acceptable for one. Since it's very telegraphed, it's a slow projectile and it's very brave even if you get hit by it. Some stunts are acceptable in a game, but it becomes a problem when there's too many of them. And out of them all, I do think accretion can stay. His shield is strictly necessary. It's impossible to take it away without reworking him, as without it, he's left super vulnerable with low HP and a short range projectile. As such, Grasp should be the one to go. It's just another defense matrix that grants him too easy of an out when the enemy gets past his shield. And besides, it's a purely reactive ability that contributes nothing but pure survival to his kit, which is something he should be able to count on his fellow tank or supports for if needed. Without Grasp, Sigma now has a significant vulnerability to being died, but he can still defend himself with a well-timed rock, and his gameplay hasn't changed much besides losing one purely defensive button. So overall, this should allow him to be balanced without killing his fun factor. And without Grasp as a defensive tool, Double Shield will be a lot harder to work. Doubly so if you pair it with my Orisa rework. As for option 2 of nerfing every ability to not take away any of them, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the correct way of doing it would be, but here's my best shot at it. Accretion can no longer bypass defense matrix-like abilities. Again, we want to keep Accretion a good skill, so he doesn't become even more hyper-defensive. Grasp will no longer regenerate overhealth, so he doesn't get 2 layers of defensive value out of it. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly of all, casting Accretion or Grasp will immediately recall Sigma's barrier back to him. Being able to do stuff while his shield is up is a big part of why he's so strong, as well as why Double Shield came to be. Same applies to Orisa. Making it so using his other abilities will force him to put his shield down is quite a brutal measure, but it still allows him to poke with his primary fire, while making him be more careful when using Accretion. Grasp should be mostly unaffected since you'd only use it when the enemy goes past your barrier anyways. I will say though, since that's a pretty brutal nerf, I must suggest that he gets his one shot back. Since he now can't save the cast Accretion behind the barrier, if he takes the risk and hits it, he should be able to get great value out of it. Additionally, this makes him rely on his team even more, which is a good thing. It means he has weaknesses that he must cover with both skill and teamwork, which is a hallmark of a good Overwatch 1 hero design. And just like that, Sigma is fixed. And together with my Orisa rework, Overwatch 1 could have been saved. And hey, who knows? If Double Shield was fixable all along, even though I didn't touch upon the real problem in this video, but we'll get to that. Maybe one day the developers will come around and we can give Sid Besides just one more chance. Just one.
Yeah. Like that's ever gonna happen. What a logic.
Bitte die Versen singt für mich!
And that's it for Sigma. Not quite as inherently problematic as Orisa, but I still wanted to give the other shield a small shake-up. I was not sure what the correct way to approach the solutions was, so I figured I'd just give a couple of options. You can let me know which one you liked best in the comments, or if you have a better solution. I wanted to take a moment to thank my friend WarriorBeat for providing most of the background footage for this video. He knows how to play the hero better than I do, so I let him handle it. And to my girlfriend for the Orisa footage from the last video. I do not know how to play Orisa, I made a whole video explaining why I have no interest in learning, and I think I made it clear enough. Lastly, I would like to thank everybody for both the support and especially the feedback on the last video. I want to make this the best I can, and that's only possible if I learn where I can improve. So seriously, thanks to everybody who brought up problems from my last video, be it with the audio, certain points I made, or the design I came up with. I do intend on making a revision on that Orisa rework, but I don't want to do it back to back since I might still be able to learn something new before I do. Anyways, if you missed my last video talking about Orisa, Overwatch 2's hostage hero, you can go watch it right now. I also give a brief explanation on what makes things problematic, as well as what makes them fun or frustrating. But I gathered that it was a little confusing, so I might redo it at a later date. Still not using the next Google Slides episodes? You can go check those out as well if it sounds absurd enough to pique your interest. Make sure to like this video if you liked it. If you didn't, comment what I can do better. I promise I read mostly everything, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss my next upload. Until then, take it away.